Hello everyone. This video is going to be a bit more personal, but it still relates to a variety of arguments for atheism, or at least against theistic arguments. And I know if you see the title, I don't want anyone to worry. I am perfectly fine now, and in fact, I have literally never been better in my entire life. That said, the journey here was not a very pleasant one, and it certainly has influenced my views and approach to atheistic philosophy of religion. So, about 4 years ago at Thanksgiving, we noticed something new was wrong with my mother, and eventually with her becoming diagnosed with dementia. Given where everybody in my family lives, I basically became her de facto caretaker, driving her around wherever she needed to go, going into doctor's appointments with her so she could remember what to do, straightening out her meds, making sure she took them, and eventually like buying all her groceries and doing all sorts of stuff. Unfortunately, things progressed incredibly quickly. Within a year and a half, she had set some kitchen utensils on fire in her own house, and while we were having her visit myself and my sister's family, we caught her in the kitchen just like playing with fire in a very unsafe way. And so, given that both me and my sister have young children, there's basically no way we could have taken her in and given her that kind of a care to make sure everybody was safe. So she had to go into an assisted living facility. There, things continued to degrade extremely rapidly. So, 4 months after she went in, she went from assisted living to memory care to then, not long after that, being in a near vegetative state to ceasing to eat to passing away. Um, so, the entire experience was obviously very painful in a wide variety of ways. I watched my mother's entire personality change dramatically. As I was told by various doctors and nurses who deal with dementia and Alzheimer's patients, people will change and it is often not for the better. And my mom was very much in the latter category. I was the one who had to deal with ranting and outbursts, some completely nonsensical, where logical contradictions meant nothing to her, others where she was more lucid and we had painful conversations. One of those that I will share is when we got the results of one of her MRIs of the brain where there was evidence of damage and we thought things were coming to an end. Her, being a devout Christian, confronted me about my atheism, asking if I really thought she would cease to exist when she died. I'm not one to lie, which certainly bit me in the ass later in the story, as I'll get to. I told her, yes, that's what I thought happened. Excuse me. Her response to that struck with me. She told me she can't believe that this was it, not after the hard life she had, and that it would just be all this and no reward. She asked me if I found my view depressing compared to hers. And I told her no, because on my view, nobody has to burn. If everyone ceasing to exist when they die meant no eternal conscious torture for anyone. And then if that's true, then my view is infinitely better than hers. And her response was to concede the point and say, well, maybe that doesn't happen and everyone goes to heaven. I had the decency not to point out the ad hoc nature of the reply or the myriad of problems with the kind of universalism she was suddenly embracing in light of her other views about biblical texts and inspiration and blah, blah, blah. So the reason I'm telling the story is because it hammered home two important points to me. One, the belief in an afterlife of heaven is useful and important to people, especially those who have lived a hard life. And two, I don't particularly care to argue people out of religion if I don't see a harm plus a logical connection between their beliefs and actions. Now, the first point seems painfully true, although it is hard not to come off as insulting when I say this, although I don't really mean to be. Note that I'm not saying this is the only reason people are religious, but I think it is a reason, and that a lot of religious people and apologists themselves reinforce this idea when they make existential arguments for theism about how there is no meaning or purpose to life if we cease to exist when we die because atheism is true. In fact, the fact about religion being a coping mechanism is reinforced from my experiences within organized atheism. You remember when New Atheism was a thing, and we had ultra liberal discourse run through the quote unquote movement? It was discussed how atheism is a belief of the privileged. We had a lot of wealthy, educated, straight, white males. Um, well, the flip side of that certainly seems to be true in at least my personal anecdote. My mother lived a particularly hard life. She grew up dirt poor as the child of immigrants from Sicily. Before marrying my father, she was in a brief marriage that was annulled because the guy turned abusive after they were married, like physically. And then her marriage to my dad, if you see my other videos, was not the greatest. They both stayed in it as long as they did because of their religion. But while my sister and I were treated very well by both of them, they very much did not like one another. Then, a lingering birth defect in my mom's pancreas not fusing together when she was in utero caused her to develop chronic pancreatitis, which is one of the most physically painful diseases that you can contract. She lived with that for over 25 years, including being on heavy prescribed opioid-based medication for that entire time, probably what led to the dementia. She would often remark about how the only thing that gave her joy was us, her kids, and then her dogs, and then eventually, and most especially, her grandchildren. My point here is that her life was hard in ways I can't particularly fathom. When things were at their hardest, she would be very much more obviously religious and use it as a palliative tool. And I say this as someone who was religious and watched her become way more Jesus-y when things were going particularly rough, right? So it's not just the atheist in me saying this. Now, conversely, my life is almost the opposite, really, which may be a contributing factor as to why I have absolutely zero problems thinking of ceasing to exist after death. But more on this later. The second point that I had was that if you follow me on YouTube or Twitter, you might be a little surprised to hear it. Although online, I don't really try to like look for ways to shit on a religious person's parade. I typically only try to reply to theists when challenged by theistic arguments. In fact, I go by the acronym or the name counter apologist specifically for this reason. Even when I make positive arguments for atheism, I don't go posting them out on theistic forums. I typically put it out there or will use it in formal debate that people have signed up for. In my personal life, I don't argue religion with anyone unless they try to use religious belief as a basis for a specific policy I find harmful. Same-sex marriage was the quintessential issue for this, at least last decade it was. Now, funnily enough, I had a line in my conversation with Emerson Green, which you should go watch. I'll put a link in the description. Um, I got into this whole public atheism advocacy partially because I thought that if we convinced people that their religion was false, then, like myself, they'd come to embrace particularly progressive views on certain social issues. And that turned out to pretty much not be the case. The other views very much need their own arguments and defenses and often hinge on the same kinds of unfalsifiable metaphysical foundational beliefs that can be as immovable as religious ones. I guess I'm here to say that I don't advocate trying to argue religion when it's not needed or if it's being used in a therapeutic way. Like when somebody's on their deathbed and they're religious, now's not the fucking time, right? No, conversely, though, I'm not going to lie and pretend that it's really true to make people feel better either. Like I have some, you know, conviction in my beliefs. When both of my parents died, I had to deal with people trying to use their deaths to convert me back to Christianity, as if their imminent or recent death was a kind of weak point for atheism. That's certainly how it felt to me at the time when those conversations were forced on me, and I think it kind of reinforces the first point I noted. Religion is a salve, a balm, used to ease the pain or fear of death. Basically, every time I had someone ask me if I thought I'd never really see them again, it really felt as if they were trying to ask me if I could emotionally handle that fact. And the answer was always yes. I firmly believe that when someone dies, they cease to exist. I am fully at peace with this fact. And while it is sad, I accept it means I will never see or speak to them again. Now, even more so, I found dealing with my mother's dementia only reinforced my inclination towards a hard materialism. Like as her brain degraded, which I observed with painful medical accuracy through regular MRI scans, I saw her mind degrade. Who she was ceased to be well before she died, both as personality changes took hold, her ability to recall memories were lost, and as she progressively lost the ability to function at all. It also reinforced my disgust at the evolutionary argument against naturalism, or basically any kind of argument from reason. Whoever says that logical thought is not inherently adaptive and beneficial, evolutionarily speaking, has plainly never had to deal with someone who is literally incapable of it, and I do mean that very, very literally. Without persistence of belief and logical reasoning, people would die. One of the things you learn when you're caring for someone with Alzheimer's or dementia is that it progresses in stages, with some days being better or worse than others, even if the overall trajectory is downward, right? So on her worst days, my mother would have basically been dead much sooner if myself or someone else wasn't there to take care of her. Now, the final point I want to make in this section is to reiterate how atheism and death being the end of our individual existence as a belief is not something I'm holding because I find it specifically comforting. I hold it because I believe it's true. Yes, I think atheism is infinitely preferable to the most common kinds of religious theism, where a hell exists. But as my mother pointed out, universalism is a logically possible option. If I wanted a kind of therapeutic religion, that's always available, but I was convinced it's as false as the more traditional kinds. Now, this, however, isn't the end of my story, because things got a lot more personal and painful before they got better. I'm going to talk about my own mortality now. So, alongside of dealing with my mother's decline and death, I was not doing particularly well physically speaking. I had been overweight for years, and this entire ordeal made it worse. In fact, we're dealing with this the year after the pandemic lockdowns, which, like many people, had increased the amount of alcohol I was consuming. And I absolutely used it as a coping mechanism. Now, to be clear, I was very rarely drunk. I'd just get to a level of buzz more than a few nights a week. My grandfather, on my mother's side, speaking of her hard life, was in fact a hard alcoholic, and I saw what that was, and I would not put my wife and children through that. But drinking regularly, even if you don't get wasted, has its costs to your health, specifically around your waistline and a variety of other things. So almost as like a mirror image to that, though, my professional career was going off like a rocket, with me getting promoted, increased responsibilities as an engineer, and becoming a de facto team leader for a group of now 17 people. That sucks, by the way. Um, Now, with this came an incredible amount of work-related stress and overtime demands. So I knew my stress levels were too high and my blood pressure was creeping up every time I went to the doctor for whatever illness was taking me there. So one Friday I said, screw this, I'm joining a gym again, and I'm forcing my job to let me work only 40 hours a week. The very next day ended up with me at the assisted living facility dealing with my mother having a major behavioral issue. I'd rather not get into the details since it's actually like pretty mundane, but as someone who can't help but be blunt and forthright with the truth, let me give you some advice I got from multiple healthcare workers who specialize in dealing with dementia patients. Lie to them. Lie to dementia patients or Alzheimer's patients when they're being unreasonable or illogical about something. I really wish I followed that advice, but I did not, which made my mom spiral and say things that fortunately she would not have to remember saying. Unfortunately for me, when I got home from dealing with the problems at the facility, I started having chest pains, shooting pains down my left arm, and my blood pressure and heart rate were spiking. To top it all off, I was actually roughly the same age as my father when he had a heart attack that I watched as a teenager. Yeah. Where still, both my daughters were sick at the time, with my wife caring for them while I dealt with everything for my mom. Now, fearing the worst, but not knowing what to do and not wanting to terrify the kids or even wait for an ambulance, I threw some clothes in a bag, kissed everyone goodbye, telling the kids I had to go take care of Donnie again, and I drove myself to the ER that is thankfully very close to home. Now, talk a little bit about the experience before I got in the car, which was fairly surreal. Um, I was like talking frantically with my wife while discreetly trying to test my blood pressure. Luckily, my oldest was upstairs playing on her computer, and my youngest kind of had like no idea what was going on because she was like 5 and sick and like playing on her tablet, like being miserable. So the pains they kind of came and went, and I was largely functional, hence why I could pack a bag and drive myself. But when the pains hit, it was like very scary. And the main fear was that every time the pain hit, it got worse and I would see everything spike with the heart rate anyway and the blood pressure was not good. Now, when I'm doing this, I remember thinking to myself that there was a very real chance that this could be it. I could die today, and I had to face that as a possible reality. And I never forget my thought. If it's like, I'm gonna fight this, but if I go, then that's it. At least I had a good life. Almost right afterwards, I looked at my youngest daughter, again, only 5 years old, miserable, with a fever, sitting at the kitchen table, trying to eat something, watching on her tablet. And she looked at me, and I think for the first time I saw her worried about me. And she had no idea what was going on, but she knew something was wrong. And that is what radicalized me right there. I already didn't want to die, even if I was ready to accept that if what would happen if it occurred. But I had to live because I needed to be there for my family. They needed me. Fortunately, when you go into an ER, they will see you very quickly when you walk in the door, say you're having chest pains, and that you know you have an elevated heart rate and blood pressure. Um, so eventually, the conclusion was that while my blood pressure was exceptionally high, it was not high enough to be in immediate danger of stroking out or having a heart attack. It was probably just a panic attack brought on by stress, and I was back in my home by the evening. And after that, I began a very long road to recovery. So I did end up using my leverage at work to get to just 40 hours a week for the most part, with allowances to leave early certain days to go to the gym 3 times a week. I made slow progress on lowering my blood pressure and weight, but then when my mother died only 6 months later, plus having the holidays around the same time, I ended up with slightly better blood pressure, my heaviest weight at 268 pounds, and although I had a lot more muscle on me than when I walked into the ER for myself back then. So basically, not 2 months after my mom's death, I was talking to my own doctor about my cholesterol being too high, as well as my blood pressure not being where it needs to be. And if I didn't make better progress, I was going to start having to go on medication every day. About a month after that, I saw a friend on Facebook that I hadn't actually seen in years post about how their Brazilian Jiu Jitsu school was opening a new location in New Jersey that was literally right between my house and my work. So I was always a little interested in combat sports, and I knew I had to do more. And funnily enough, the one person I was speaking to when I walked in told me Jiu-Jitsu will change your life, and she was 100% correct. Um, Now, as an aside, I'm going to point out how interesting it is that taking fight classes can fill the same kinds of roles that going to a church regularly would fill. And I don't really mean this in an existential way, but more practically. So first, it reduces stress, and in my opinion, better than church ever did. Two, you feel as if you've done something wrong if you miss going when you regularly go. And three, it gives you a whole new circle of friends you normally wouldn't interact with because you're bonding over a unique common interest. Now, amazing as it is, Brazilian Jiu Jitsu alone wasn't the only thing that helped me at the time, although it has been like the underlying key. About the same time, I was also listening to a lot of what the left has called manosphere podcasts. So, like Joe Rogan, Chris Williamson, Tom Segura, Bert Kreischer. This was all pre-election, and they weren't all hardcore Trump stuff all the time, which made regular listening like possible for me. Um, and this is where I got a lot of the advice I needed to hear exactly at that point in time. Exercise isn't enough, as a year of going to the gym showed me. Diet is more important for weight loss. Doing both is what's going to help you the most. And that it's good to get into things like fighting and Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, and it's good to get into lifting and like push for gains. So after a month of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, I was on a calorie deficit diet. I increased cardio when I hit the gym, and I was switching things up to take more fight classes and less days at the gym. 7 months later, I added non-sparring Muay Thai to my class rotation. Eventually, I ended up quitting the gym because I could lift more if I used dumbbells at home. My main constraint is making sure that anytime I spend training of whatever type, it doesn't take away from being home and helping with my family responsibilities. So I will get up some days of the week at 5 a.m. to lift in my garage before my wife and kids wake up, and I will take my classes at specific times when it doesn't interfere with home life. So I like to say that getting your ass kicked every week makes you stay on a diet, and it has been just over a year now. And I touched on my goal weight of 180 pounds, although realistically I hover between that and 185 depending on the week. I am literally in the best shape of my life right now. It's pretty good. So Uh, I have a one of my points of pride is that like I've been told I was strong by some of the guys I roll with, which just like threw me over the moon. So that was really nice. I hope they don't see this or hear me geek out about that. Other good news is my blood pressure is now excellent. My heart is completely clear, and for the first time in years, I have good cholesterol, all without meds. I'm also handling my stress significantly better than I had in the past, although that's still definitely something I need to work on given my personality and my job situation. So that's my happy ending of sorts. I have been able to fight myself back to good health after years of stress and bad eating habits. I still very much enjoy my whiskey, although I much more strictly limit myself now. In terms of lessons learned from this as it relates to atheistic philosophy of religion, I can legitimately say I faced what I thought was a real chance of dying, and I held to the kinds of Stoic principles that I read when I was studying atheistic philosophy when I deconverted. I found comfort in the idea that I had led a good life and that if I died, I wouldn't be suffering because I would no longer exist. That said, I do wonder if I'm able to hold to that because I have lived a privileged, happy life. I don't need an afterlife because I'm content with this one. If I had to deal with as much adversity as my mother, would I be so utterly unmoved by the kinds of existential arguments theistic apologists make? I really don't know. But then I can tell you that when I hear an argument about how existentially scary it will be if we just cease to exist when we die, I kind of feel like they might as well tell me to be afraid of the boogeyman. Now, I did learn in that moment that my primary desire was to live for my family as well as myself, and that was the motivation I used to push as hard as I have to get my health in line. This is the only life I get, after all. And while I really don't think I can decisively argue for materialism, it is what seems most plausible to me. And as a very physical being, I damn well should engage in building up this material body as best I can, which is what I intend to do. If everything goes well, I'll be training until I literally can't anymore. And it's actually kind of fun to do that. So, my advice is to take care of yourselves. It is so worth it. Thanks for watching.